Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Lynn Serafin from Trentino, genealogy.com. And this is the Fileo Friday podcast for Friday, the 3rd of February, 2023. I had to look up the date to make sure I had the right date. And I'm glad to see a lot of you coming in and telling me that you can hear me perfectly. I'm filming it on my phone, but looking on my computer to see your comments because I can't do both at the same time. Anyway, it's been a little while since I've done a Fileo Friday podcast because I was ill before Christmas and then January was catching up, and so here we are again. And I'm really glad to come back and have another podcast. And there's so many new people in the group, and hopefully this will be a good initiation for them to get used to what we do on Fileo Friday. Now, to remind everybody what Fileo means. Fileo it's a word that comes from the word for spinning. Filare means to spin, and it has a double meaning. Fileo was the practice in Trentino back in the days before they had radio and TV and Netflix and things like that. It was the practice of telling stories. It was oral tradition passed down from one generation to the next. It was usually often done in the winter time when people would huddle together to be warm, sometimes in the sheds in the barns where the cows and sheep and all them were in the winter. Not the barns, but it was actually under the houses in the mountains. And this is where they would tell stories. It was a way of, as I say, keeping warm. It was a way of entertaining. It was a way of passing on oral history. It was a way of having fun. It was a way of being creative. And this story I'm going to be talking about today is actually something that has been in a lot of Fileo in the past. So that's something I just want you to bear in mind. I say it's a double meaning because it was also traditionally the time of day. It was usually done between dinner and bedtime. It was traditionally the time of day where the women would be spinning the yarns as well. So you're spinning a yarn with the tail, which may be where the word comes from, I don't know, or the term comes from, and you're also spinning the yarns literally while the tales are being told. So let's bring us into that space. This is what Fileo is, and we're preserving the tradition here, even though it's not practiced commonly in Trentino anymore. So as this is a genealogy group, I know I told you the title of today's podcast is, let me see what I actually wrote, Val Rendena in the 1400s, Violence, Vendettas, and Battles for Power. Now, it is going to be about that, but since this is a genealogy group, I want to tell you how I came upon this in the first place. What was I actually doing that caused me to stumble upon this particular family? Well, I was doing research for a client who's actually a distant cousin of mine as well. Well, not that distant. He's like a second cousin once removed on my father's side, but this was on his line, his paternal line, which is not my line. I don't share that line. So I wasn't familiar with this particular family. I had found his ancestors up to a certain point in the past because they were already on my extended family tree, but I hadn't researched past, say, the early 1700s. I hadn't gone any further back on this particular line. Now, where it was a family called the Levri, who I know from loads of other records. They were a noble family originally from Fiave. They were noted to be notaries. And one particular line lived in Larido, which is a frazione in my father's parish in Santa Croce d'Obleggio, and this is in Val Giudicari. Now, if you saw the map I put up in the group before, you'll see kind of where that is. It's in Giudicari Esteriori. That's where my father came from. But everything we're going to be talking about today is about Giudicari Interiori. So I'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, this particular fellow, his name was Simone Levri. He married a woman named Angela Bertelli. Now, I knew the name Bertelli because I had Bertelli ancestors. They're not going to be related too easily. They probably are, but I don't know how yet to the line I'm going to be talking about today. Because the Bertelli came from Preore, which is it's on the side of a mountain. It's in Giudicari Interiori, really kind of today part of Ragoli. It's the same place. They're just really adjacent to each other. But back then they were considered to be two different places. And the Bertelli lived there for ages. So I assumed that's where she was from because the marriage records in Santa Croce were missing. from this particular era. So I couldn't find out very much about her. However, when I did deeper research into my clients' ancestors, and I found actually the baptismal record of their daughter, whose name was Josepha, it had something very, and I'm going to have to put my glasses on, so pardon me if you see a shine. I have to read it with my glasses because it's complex. The mother's name was spelled out quite clearly, and it called her the Noble Lady Angela. So this is the Bertelli I'm talking about. The Noble Lady Angela, daughter of the late, I'm translating it obviously, daughter of the late illustrious Dominus Felice Bertelli de Montegigli e Castro Volsana. Now I said, well, oh my God, what's that? Well, I wasn't sure what that meant precisely, but what I could do was I recognized immediately that this was some kind of predicate. Now, a predicate is a thing that would be added on to surnames if a family happened to be imperial nobility. Now, imperial nobility means they got the award from the emperor or somebody in his family, somebody in that line, not from, say, the bishop. So when you would see stylized honorifics like the illustrious so-and-so or the most illustrious so-and-so, and then have these predicates after it, these such and such, blah, 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 you can tell that this person is probably of imperial nobility, well, almost definitely was ennobled by the emperor at some point. Now, I have this book and many other books that have lots of noble families, information on noble families. Not all of them they're not very interested in genealogy. They're just really interested in when was the title given, who was it given to, who gave it to whom, what date, and stuff like that. So I did find this particular line. And the way it was written in this record was a bit stylized again, and the title was De Montegiglio, and it was of Castell Volsana. Now, I recognized it finally, that Volsana is actually an old word for Ossana. And Ossana is a parish in Val di Sole. So now I'm starting to go, oh my goodness. And here it says also that this family were from Caderzone, which is not Priori. It's further north from Priori, but it's kind of not too far away. So then I'm just showing you the line of what I went through. Then I found, and if you remember one of my past podcasts, I mentioned somebody named Giovanni Ciccolini. He wrote this book on Ossana. It's a huge book. He's like the historian on Val di Sole. As I say, Ossana's in Val di Sole. Now, lo and behold, he had a whole section on this very Bertelli family that I was looking for. And not only that, get this was a treasure. He had a family tree. Okay, now it only went, and they were called in here, it says Albero genealogico di Bertelli di Vigo Priori, which means the family tree of the Bertelli of Vigo Priori. Vigo was the name of the frazione in Priori, and it says nobles of Caderzone. So it's telling me two things. It's saying that they were from Priori, actually, they were, but they were nobles of Caderzone, and Caderzone is one of the villages in one of the parishes in Val Rendena. And so this chart took back so far, but not all the way back. And he spoke a little bit about how they came to be. And this is where the story begins, because this family actually were related, not in the past, but they came to be related to the Counts of Lodron. And the story of how they got connected this is where the soap opera begins. And this is where I say this is like something out of the Medici or the Borgias, off Netflix or, or whatever. This really is a story like what they're telling there. So I'm going to go into some of this story so that you get the idea of how kind of interesting it is. Now, before I get into the story itself, I have to say a couple of things about nobility and also geography. Now, first of all, almost everybody I do a tree for has some kind of nobility in their family. But most of us have nobles who are, say, of either rural nobility or nobles of the bishop. Well, rural nobility is a kind of bishopric nobility. Not all are imperial nobility. That's slightly different. And also, even fewer are counts. Now, counts are the top of the pack, short of when you start to get into royalty. They are the highest ranking in the area. So very few of us, in this group anyway, are descended, at least from paternal lines, from counts. Some might be through female lines, and those are less documented. And that's why it's so exciting to me to see this, because this marriage wasn't even mentioned in any of them, because it was no longer Bertelli. And I found this interesting to find all of these connections. But anyway, so bear that in mind, that this was more exciting for me because I hadn't seen this connection with a client before to the Counts of Lodron. Now, the other thing is that a case of geography. I shared in the group the map. Now, I'm going to be talking about Val Rendena. Now, Val Rendena doesn't actually appear on the map, and that's because it's considered to be a sub-valley of the interior part of the Val Giudicari. In fact, if you look at the map and you'll see Giudicari, there are actually two valleys. There's the Interiori and the Esteriori. My dad came from Esteriori, although I have lots of ancestors from Interiori. Interiori is on the western side, and that's where you find places like Tione, Preore, Raguli, and all of those places in that area. Saone is way at the bottom. And so those are Interiori, and as you go further up, you start to get into the area that's called Val Rendena. And what do you find in Val Rendena? You find places like Pinsolo, which you might have seen pictures of the dance macabre there, and also Modena de Campiglio, those kinds of places, Carisolo and Bocinego, and also, of course, Caderzone, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So those are all in Val Rendena, but Caderzone is not actually that far from Preore if you look at it on a map, even though they're considered different places. Preore is part of Giudicari Interiore, Caderzone is Val Rendena, but they are technically different valleys, but not really, if you know what I mean. So they're not really that far away. So if you get that kind of geographically in your head, and also the fact that we're looking at counts specifically. Now, the Lodron, what I want to say about them is that they were, anytime I ever read about them, and I don't have any of them in my own family, anytime I ever read about them, they were always said to be really notorious and ruthless. They apparently were very violent. They went around, they made their fame and fortune, a lot of it by being mercenaries and sacking things, and they were ruthless, apparently ruthless with a lot of their subjects. Bear in mind that it's always the winners who write histories. So we have to always take some of these stories with a grain of salt. But they were, in terms of legend and in terms of what we have passed down to us, they were known to be ruthless, and they would attack places. And they were also aligned for a while with the Republic of Venice, which were not really pro Prince Bishop. They were really quite antithetical to each other. And they also had arch enemies down in the Rovereto area as well. So setting that kind of scene, we come to their presence in Val Rendena. They were known to have property, at least since the very, very beginning of the 1300s. They owned houses and property in Val Rendena. They weren't counts yet. The person who, before I get to this, I'll say this now. We want to think about how titles are passed down. And this is important. I'll be getting to this. This is going to be an important point. Titles. How are noble titles passed down? Well, usually either male or female children could inherit a title. However, a female child could not pass that title on to her children. All right? There are exceptions, and we're going to see one later in this story. It's always an extreme exception. So, but at any rate, that's the way it is. And also, boys had to be legitimate in order to inherit titles from their father. Now, this is only exacerbated by the fact that a lot of these nobles had a lot of affairs. They had probably had a lot of illegitimate children. And this is going to come into play as we see the story of the next person. Now, the next person I want to mention is a gentleman named Giorgio of Lodron. He was born somewhere around 1400, the year 1400, or maybe a little bit before 1390, somewhere in that area. He was, let me look up the name of his father because it's hard for me to pronounce, Aldraginio or something like that. Alberginio. It's not a name I'd ever seen before. Alberginio. He grew up to be a military leader. And in fact, he helped defend the bishop. What did he see? He ousted, what does it say? In 1439, they had killed over 2,000 people when the troops, the Lodron, had actually driven out the Counts of Arco and the Prince Bishop in Castell Romano. I think I maybe have mixed this up a bit because the next thing doesn't make any sense. Yes, I think it does, actually. It does make sense. Okay, so he actually had led an attack, and, they said there were over 2,000 corpses or whatever. Now, shortly after this, he was then declared a count of the Holy Roman Empire. So here is where you can start to see this battle between the emperor and the Prince Bishop. You can see this battle going on. So he was given a title of count, and this was in 1452. And but at this point he swore also allegiance to the Prince Bishop, who was under the service of the Holy Roman Emperor. I'm getting things a little mixed up in terms of alliances, but this is when he did receive this title. And he was also named a vicar and one of the judges in charge of the judiciary. So apologies for whose alliance is what. This has got to do with too many translations from too many different books. But this is when he received the title of count, and he was a military leader. And it's supposed to be quite vicious. Now, he was, as I said, he was appointed sometime between before 1415, he was appointed the vicar of the whole judiciary area, in that area in Interiori. Now, Giorgio had an illegitimate son, and his name was Marco, and he's the one we're going to be focusing on in a minute. Marco was born sometime around 1430. One book says he was the son of some woman in Caderzone, some village woman. Now, how do we know that? I don't know. But the funny thing about this is that Marco recognized him as his son. And even though he couldn't pass his title or his name onto his son, he gave him lots of privileges. He gave him tithing privileges. They call it the decima. He gave him houses, all kinds of property. This is very interesting to me because why this son? Why this particular son? Nobody asks this question. Now, to me, I really strongly doubt he was the only illegitimate son of Giorgio de Lodron. That's my feeling. I mean, these counts had a lot of illegitimate children all over the place. They did whatever they want, pretty much. So I'm very surprised that this particular son was one that he was so fond of, especially since Giorgio had many other legitimate sons. And they all, followed in his footsteps. Now, this particular son, Marco, was, it made me think that maybe he was the son of, a particular mistress that Giorgio was very fond of or whatever. There's no way of knowing, but these are the kinds of questions I wish history would ask more. I don't think we can find the answers, but it does make me wonder why. So I feel like there's some story going on there. And if I were dramatizing it, I might dramatize that into this story, but as an historian, I can't because we don't know. But it does make me ask this question. Why this son? Why was he so favored? Now, this particular son, Marco, even though he couldn't take the title, he did go around, whenever he was referred to, he always called himself and was referred to as the biological son, they called it the natural son, the biological son of the most illustrious Count Giorgio de Lodron, Vicario of the Prince Bishop and all this stuff. So he really identified with his father. Furthermore, any time the Lodron had some kind of dirty work to do, like they wanted to invade something, they hired him, not hired him, but they got him to do it. And he would muster up groups, bands of mercenaries, essentially, who would come basically and let's go sack this place, or let's go sack that place, let's go set fire to this place or that place, and we'll share the bounty, the booty with each other or whatever. This is what he did. He was doing it really for his family, maybe to gain the favor of his family. I don't know. But it's very interesting, I find, that he was involved on this level. He apparently was known for misdeeds. He was known to be a rascal, a mischief maker. But again, as I say, history is written by the victors. And when we see some of the things that happen later, I find it very odd. Some of the things that have to do with his story and his family's story, I find very strange indeed. But anyway, the thing that happened, the thing that brought him the most notoriety, and this is fairly well documented, he, in, what year was it now? I have to look it up. Is it 1474, I think? 1474? Yes, okay. In 1474, this is in November 1474, he and a band of, it is said, 100 hired mercenaries, attacked Castell Corno, which is not far from Rovereto. Now, apparently this castle was owned by the Castelbarco family. It was always owned by them. And they were the arch enemies of the Lodron. So it was really the Lodron, it was just a power struggle. So he attacked this castle. And it was not a successful attack. Apparently they were thwarted by being kept from scaling the walls. And some people were captured. One of his main people was captured, tortured mercilessly, and they got a confession out of him. And the person who confessed said, yeah, there was 100 of us, we were led by Marco, blah, 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 and that person was executed. Okay, so here's a person who confessed, he was executed, but what happened to Marco? Nothing yet. This is what I find so strange. He went back to Caderzone, apparently, and apparently, according to the historians, he had bands of what they call bravi, who were essentially, again, mercenary kind of people, guys who were hired by the Count to go out and wreak havoc and mess with the public and just kind of terrorize them. And he had people working for him like that. And one historian says, he used to hide, he used to come back through secret ways back to Caderzone, and it looked like he had never left. Nobody could actually bear witness against him. How they know this, I don't know. I think this may be, again, part of the Fileo story, that some of this is telling tales. But we do know that it was confessed that he was the leader of that attack. But now years are going by, and nothing has happened to him yet. People are still complaining, but nothing has happened to him yet. He, in fact, was elected. He was called the Noble Signore. He was served as he was representing the community of Caderzone in a dispute with Pinsolo 10 years after that attack. Very strange stuff. Very, very strange stuff. But then, finally, this would be now 15 years later. 15 years later, in 1489, a gentleman named, and this is where we come in the Bertelli, a gentleman named Marco Bertelli, who was son of a man named Tomeo, and I think I've kind of gotten some of their lineage, who was a Massaro of the bishop, and he was from Priori, so not from Caderzone, he was from Priori. This is where the Bertelli came from. He made it a point of going and getting Marco of Caderzone arrested. By the way, Marco only called himself Marco of Caderzone, Marco de Caderzone, because he couldn't call himself of Lodron, because he was illegitimate. Anyway, so they captured him. And by the next year, sometime in early 1490, he was beheaded. We don't know the actual date. We don't even know the actual place. There are two sides of the story. One story says he was captured and taken to Trento and put on trial and executed there, but there's no account of that. Another says he was actually executed as soon as he was captured because they were afraid that his mercenaries would come and set him free, or his family, the other Lodron, would set him free, which probably was a legitimate fear. But he was beheaded, so they say. And I don't think it was a case of, I don't think that was myth. I think that probably happened. I think he probably was executed. Now, it says that he was beheaded because it was considered, beheading actually was a death given to people of noble or royal blood as opposed to hanging, which is really odd. But that's how it was thought of back then. I guess they thought it was less suffering. So he was given it in honor of his noble blood, even though he was not officially a Lodron. So he was beheaded. Now, what happened next is really, to me, the soap opera bit. A few years later, Marco, by the way, Marco had several sons. I think he had 4. And one of them especially, and I think his name was also Giorgio. I have to look up the names. Yes, Giorgio and Giacomino. They decided to take revenge against this Marchetto Bertelli. So a few years later, and I have to look up the date, but it's only a few years later, after 1490, I think it was 1494. Yeah, I think that's when it was. They sought out Marchetto Bertelli a priori. And now at this time, Marchetto, who was a notary and he was, Massaro and all this stuff, he was in a public meeting in Tione, in the village of Tione, actually in a frazione outside Tione, in public. And the sons, Giorgio and Giacomino, came with bandits in disguise. It says bearded, in disguise and with beard-ons, came in and just killed him right in the middle of town, right in the middle of a town meeting, just like that. Again, like I say, this is something right out of the Medici or the Borgias. It's just like that, just right in the middle of a town meeting. They slaughtered him. Well, what happened to them? Well, this is, again, really, really strange. They were not taken into account to it, not really. They were, after several years, and it's because, one of the historians says, it's because they actually were needed. These people were actually needed by the Prince Bishop to help run the areas. Instead of taking them to, executing them, they were actually pardoned and absolved. And it said they could not be executed or exiled, and they weren't to have their lands taken away. However, they had to have a whole lot of agreements. They had to swear allegiance to the Prince Bishop. They had to swear allegiance to the captain of Stenico, who they almost tried to kill. So they had to swear allegiance to them, and they could only sell property to people who they approved of. So this was very, very strange. So now, with time, and that's what I can't find. That's what I find so bewildering, is that these were people who actually murdered somebody in public, and were seen, witnessed doing this in public, beards or not, and they got off the hook. Well, this is, the 1400s. So, and this is, maybe they thought they were maybe it was given that they were justified, or it was a crime of passion because this man had been responsible for their father's death. I have no idea, but I find it very soap opera-ish and very weird. But anyway, these 2 sons died without any heirs. Okay, they had one other brother named Biagio. Now, Biagio apparently, one historian says he lived to be 114 years old. I don't know about that, but he lived to be a very old man. But he also didn't have any sons, but he had one daughter. He had one daughter. Nobody says her name except for one historian who says her name is Ursula, but this historian doesn't give any sources, and I have no idea where they got the name Ursula from. It's perfectly reasonable it could have been, because that name appears a lot in Bertelli ancestry, but no idea. When I say Bertelli, you'll see why. Anyway, Ursula di Marco, so she's now the granddaughter of Marco who got beheaded. She then married a Jacopo Bertelli. Now, who was Jacopo? As far as I can tell, he was the grandson of a brother of Marchetto. So in other words, Jacopo Bertelli, try to imagine this, Jacopo Bertelli was a grandnephew of the man who killed this woman's grandfather. And they got married. And not only that, that she was also the niece of the men who killed his grandfather's brother. So both sides had killed each other. And at this point, they got married. Now, this is where I'm coming back to the inheritance. They couldn't inherit the title of Lodron because this was not a legitimate line of Lodron. However, they still had a lot of property and rights in Caderzone. They had the rights to collect taxes and things like that, and property. Now, because there were no heirs, and this daughter was the sole heir, and she actually brought all of that as a dowry into her marriage. And now, this is where the noble Bertelli of Caderzone began. They were noble in some ways, but later on they became more noble. And so this is where they started. So this particular line of Bertelli, their children, not that man Jacopo, but their children and their children's children, and my clients' ancestors from this line are descended from that illegitimate son of Giorgio Lodron, who was beheaded in 1490. So that's that story, and that's how they came together. As you read their story further, the Bertelli went on to receive their own imperial nobility later in 1636, I think is the year. Marcantonio Bertelli, who was also an ancestor of my client. And then as you go further, my client was actually his mother, not mother, but his ancestor, that Angela I mentioned. She's mentioned in a book, but nothing's mentioned about her. Somebody mentioned her birth, and I found her birth date, her record. She was actually born in Trento, the city. And but nobody says anything about her. She's the one who married the Levri. So the thing is, the Bertelli of Caderzone went on for quite some time. They finally died out in the early 1900s. Not 1900s, the early 1800s. I think around 1820, in that area. They died out. The line is extinct in Caderzone. The surname is extinct, but that does not mean that their descendants are all gone, because there are lots of little pockets of families who have come up from different daughters. I can't imagine that the one that I discovered is the only one. There's got to be others. But this is the thing. If you happen to be descended from that couple, that's Simone Levri and Angela Bertelli, you're descended from the Counts of Lodron, and that's really kind of interesting history. So anyway, that's going to be it for now, because if I go on too much, I'm going to have to get into too many other details and whatever. I hope that interests you, just to see that there's so much intrigue going on, so much violence, so much vendetta, and so much unexplainable justice or lack thereof towards not just towards the underlings, but towards the nobles. Why in the world did they get off the hook? Would this have happened today? We sometimes idealize and romanticize the past, but heck, that, to me, that's pretty heavy, all of that going on. It's just, why were people having all these vendettas and then just suddenly let off the hook? Because of money and power and balance of power. Interesting stuff. Anyway, so thought maybe you might like that story, and I hope you did.